Alright, so I love the idea of world building. I love the slow building of a thing, looking at an environment and wondering what kinds of people might have developed here, how they might have eked out a living from the difficult terrain, and left alone, especially in a fantasy world, what might they have turned out like? When I was young, video games and television shows of the mid-90s grabbed my attention chiefly based on their worlds. Warcraft was enthralling because the instruction manual had information about how the individual people groups functioned, their hopes and dreams, and I marveled at the fact that the orcs were simply a people, not evil by nature like they were in so many other series. The Metroid games grabbed me for the ominous feeling they held, and even Zelda seemed all the bigger for the fact that things in that world continued on when you weren't there, taking full advantage of one of the first night and day cycles in a game. But I think I most fell in love with world building with Star Wars and Lord of the Rings. These two universes were so expansive, so immense that you could easily find a way to insert yourself into those worlds. And I think that's where all of this begins. The ability to see yourself in that world. As the years went on and I drew and drew and drew, I found that my work naturally tailored itself toward world building. I wanted to create from the ground up, to bring something to life that no one had ever seen before. Of course, the first drawings were amateur, and my first map was oddly conforming to the borders of a normal piece of paper. Those first steps were fundamental to my journey, and largely what kept me working when other motivations evaporated into nothing. But I am not alone in this. World building, creating settings, writing stories to serve as a platform for your art, they are everywhere these days. There is something fundamentally human about the desire to create ex nihilo, from nothing. Of course, our work is always influenced by the things around us, including other media we have consumed, but that hardly matters. In this episode, we are going to explore this world-building desire, or at least begin to do so, functioning under this assumption: building a world will make you a better artist. Greetings, my name is Zach, and if discussions about creative problem solving and topics like this are your cup of tea, please consider subscribing. Well, as per usual, what is world building? I have struggled to find a definition on this specifically that satisfies me. Of course, you can look up, how did Tolkien define world building, or how does Brandon Sanderson define world building? And though you may come up with results, the former does not talk about it in the same way we might, and the latter already knows the population understands the concept and talks about how he does it, as opposed to what it actually is most of the time. Tolkien referred to this as sub-creation, creating in creation essentially. As a devout Catholic, he seemed to see the creation of his worlds as mirroring his creator in some small way. So when we talk about world building, in essence, we are referring to the creation of a secondary world, generally, a world that has its own rules, laws of physics, universal constants, shared histories, mythologies, and religions, believable technological advancements, and the merger of these things with magic, if applicable. It is the creation of races, creatures, and entities to exist within that environment, ideally constructed in a meaningful way as to mirror our own world in some capacity. It allows for the asking of questions. Would the Industrial Revolution have occurred if magic existed? How would life be different if there were dragons? And explore those things in a fictional context. And yet, at the end of all this, world building is just that. The artificial creation of a theoretical and imaginary world. Beyond just talking about world building, I actually want to focus on why it's important. Obviously, this stems from my love of the thing, from my investment in it, but after 20 years of building stories, drawing buildings to house characters I love that have not even hit the page yet, I've managed to see some magnificent benefits to that obsession. In this episode, I want to explore that. Why I think for any artist, the idea of creating a world and filling it with your designs, loving it like a child, and slowly helping it to grow almost independent of you can be such a wonderful thing. We are going to start with some more ephemeral benefits, and then afterward move into some very practical ones. I tend to striate things like this because I love lists and organizations, if you couldn't already tell. So what are some of the ephemeral benefits? It gives you a long-term focal point. A motivation workaround, if you will. When the world exists in your mind, it hits a critical mass where it is real to you. It is a thing. Even if you haven't written anything down yet or drawn out your characters, you have a wealth of things to tap into. For me, and I know for many others, this creates the ability to work around some of the normal motivation pitfalls. When you sit down to draw, to create something, and you have no ideas, no inspiration, no motivation, it's easy to jump back into your own world. After all, things exist there, and even if you just resort to drawing that character, that castle, that magic for the 50th time, it's still drawing. And you get to be teleported to that world. What a wonderful thing. You get to do something different than anyone else. Yes, many people will invade their own worlds, but your world inevitably is going to be unique to you, even if it does bear many similarities to other people's worlds. After all, your world cannot be the same as anyone else's, even if it is largely influenced by others. It will always have a distinct you-ness to it. As you are listening to this, and as I'm recording my voiceover for it, I went and collected some old footage from old podcasts, specifically because each of these drawings are excerpts from my worlds. And so I get to watch these kind of interestingly at the same time that you are. I'm reviewing these. These are massive drawings. Each of them are large Bristol and ink and brush pen drawings. Most of them are 18 by 24, so pretty decent size, and they take a long time. Some of these took somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 12 hours. These drawings exist because I had a world that I wanted to depict, a world that I wanted to put down on paper. Now, in some capacities, yes, I could sit down and draw those things from imagination, but imagination drawing is quite difficult. So in a lot of ways, I looked up buildings. I looked up how light might affect things. And in this drawing, for example, the first one, when I got to the clouds at the end, I was really dissatisfied with how the clouds worked. So I actually spent some time studying clouds the week after that. And that's how this goes a lot of the time. When you focus on a large-scale project, and especially when it's important to you, you seem to not be okay with letting things be mediocre. There were a lot of things on the drawings that you'll see in the background of this podcast that I focused on, that I spent extra time working on. In one of the later ones where there's a wagon in the foreground, I looked up wagons. I tried to understand how they functioned. When I was writing that chunk of the book, I actually spent some time researching the Oregon Trail and trying to figure out how those things function. You learn so much from exploring a world. When I sit down nowadays to work on my robots, which you've seen probably in some of the sketchbook sessions, those robots all belong potentially to a secondary world, a story that I've created that actually takes place underneath the ice of Siberia in kind of a not well, actually it is post-apocalyptic, but it's post-apocalyptic alternate history where the Cold War went very, very wrong and quite literal. But all of those robots potentially fit into that. And so when I sit down to draw the robots, yes, they're part of a series. Yes, I have to have them for the sketchbook sessions. But at the end of the day, I'm imprinting upon them elements of that story, elements of that world. And that's why they each have personalities, or at least I try to give them personalities. Things don't always turn out exactly the way you want, but I try to impart these other aspects to them. I can sit down and work on those when I don't know what I'm doing at all, because there's enough of a world developed that I always have things that I can kind of go to. A lot of these drawings that you're going to watch today are the same way. They're worlds that I've thought about and I've chewed on for long enough, so if I don't really know what I need to work on today or what I want to work on, I've always got these worlds that, well, I can go draw that railgun, I can go draw that castle, I can go draw that, skyscraper and see kind of where my brain rolls with it. Generally, once I get started working, it's easier to keep working. An object in motion tends to stay in motion. And at the end of the day, it's fun. It's fun to create these things, fun to create from nothing. Though, of course, we can't actually do that. We kind of trick ourselves into thinking that we are. I imagine that if you were listening to this right now, that you enjoy creating things. So I don't really feel like it's necessary to spend too much time on that point, that it's fun to create things. But let's look at this very specific subset of that, creating something new, something from nothing. To create something new, something taken from the amalgamation of your loves and life and to slam them together to create something unique is a wonderful feeling. After all, if you are taking all of the things that you love and you're combining them, it hopefully will be something that you love even more and is a really true representation of some of your artistic soul. We do this often in almost everything we create, of course. But to build upon this, create another thing to stand beside that first one, then a home to put those little figures within, each stage of that process can not only be enjoyable, but it feels like compound interest. The whole becomes far more than the sum of its parts, and you end up having a beautiful arrangement of things, all set in the same space in your mind, and now upon that page or upon that canvas. Obviously, I speak about this from experience. Though art has long been a struggle for me, I have always found joy in the creation of these worlds. It is difficult for me to represent characters the way I desire, the way that they appear in my mind. I'm sure many of you can identify with that. When I finally manage to nail something down, a city gate, a country's emblem, a banner, a sword, the satisfaction is unlike anything else I experience artistically. When that thing tangibly exists, it feels like I mined ore from my brain. I found an unpolished stone, and through hard work, trial and error, and often tears, I now hold a beautiful opal in my hands, glimmering for me to see. And the beautiful part is, once the ideas are out of your head, they can be shown to others, to a careful few that you know are safe, and in some cases, they can even inspire others to do the same. But another beautiful additional fact here is once they're on the canvas, on the paper, they can be modified. And that's a wonderful thing about artistic stuff is once it's out there, once you can look at it, then you can push and pull and change things into the forms that you really want them to be. The first drawing, the first sketch is almost never going to be what you want. But that's an accepted and a beautiful thing because once it's there, now it can be manipulated. Creating worlds allows us to emulate our heroes, the great creators of our past. And if you're religious, you're God. I mentioned this earlier in regards to Tolkien, and for him it was certainly a huge piece of what drove his individual sub-creation. I think, however, that this is something that most of us can imbibe of, regardless of our particular religious beliefs. Emulating those that we look up to is a great motivation. We get to tap into the same things they did, the same ideas, the same concepts, and the same joy. Though I talk about Tolkien a lot and my massive love for the Lord of the Rings on this channel, it was actually the game Warcraft 2 by Blizzard, before they were bought by Activision, way back in the day, that inspired a lot of my own sub-creation. When I was looking at the instruction manual, when I was playing the game and really imbibing of the dialogue, I became aware that in this story, the good guys and bad guys were not as clearly delineated as they were in most children's stories. In most games like that, you would play as a human, you would kill orcs and trolls and ogres and things like that. In this game, however, there was a campaign for both sides. You could play as the humans, dwarves, and elves, kind of the Tolkienian good guys, but you could also play as the orcs, trolls, and ogres, the Tolkienian bad guys. But because I hadn't run into Tolkien at this point, I was only going off of what I had seen in other areas of the culture, which of course was influenced in the exact same place, in the exact same way. But that gave me this understanding that you can have two factions in a world where there are bad guys. Like there is absolutely an evil force in the Warcraft universe. It's the demons, it's the Burning Legion. But they are kind of extricated from both sides. The humans think that the orcs are evil. The orcs just want to have a new home and they don't know why the humans are trying to genocide them. And so you get these two factions that are running up against each other. And at multiple points in the series, especially now with World of Warcraft continuing for so long, you actually get situations where the two sides work together. They work together to fight a common enemy or just because the world's going to end, for the 17th time. But that game started to open my mind to things because units could be upgraded. So you had a sense of evolution of things. Buildings were upgraded. I love old real-time strategy games. They're really probably my favorite category of game. But all of those things from an artistic standpoint and from a world building standpoint were wonderful because it gave this idea of progression. And a lot of the things that you explored in that world had massive world building and lore elements and historical elements back behind. So when Warcraft 3 came out, of course, I was really, really excited. We got two new races to play as, the Night Elves and the Undead. And they both had all of their own lore. And the Undead were, very decidedly evil at first, but as the game starts to unpack, and especially as you get into World of Warcraft, the Undead become this unhinged relic of a past that they had no part in creating and they're now subject to. They're animated corpses who were animated to wage a war that wasn't their war, and now they're free and they call themselves the Forsaken. All of these things were just so wonderful to latch onto. There was depth everywhere you looked. When you explored those worlds, there was always something where it was like, what is this place? When did this come into being? How long ago were these ruins put together? All of those things were just wonderful and so inspiring. And so when I started really creating my first worlds, I was in middle school. I had read The Hobbit probably a dozen times, but I didn't read Lord of the Rings until high school. So I was creating really largely based off of games like Warcraft, games like the Metroid series. And I had one other friend who had started this process prior to me. And Star Wars, of course, was always a part of my influence. It was always this amazing, expansive thing. But when the new movies, the prequels, started to come out and they expanded that world and all my friends started reading all the books, it was like, oh my goodness, this thing is massive. So all of those influenced me. And in a lot of ways, as a young boy, as a young man, I was emulating my heroes, emulating these great creators of worlds that had come before me. And then fortunately, when I was in high school, I was finally introduced to the person that many would consider the king of it, which is Tolkien. And, the rest is history. But banking off of that same point, often worlds are what capture other people, just like they capture us, just like they captured me. I think each of us have a world we wish we could live in, or at least we wish that in our youth. And maybe if we were honest, we still kind of wish that, right? Did you ever run around pretending to defeat stormtroopers, attack an orc, or earthbend when you ran around outside on the playground? We are captivated by stories, by these worlds. In our artwork, we have the ability to construct our own world for us to dive into, and also a world that might do the same for others. This world can be a retreat, a safe place to visit during tough times, or a thing to pass on to other humans. If we return to Tolkien for a moment, his work was very much this. It carried on the legacy from his early days. He served in World War I. He had a whole bunch of writing friends who he met with weekly, if I'm remembering correctly, C.S. Lewis among them, and they all had these stories and these worlds and these things that they were building. And most of those friends died in World War I. And so at some level, Tolkien was stuck with, okay, it's just Lewis and I, we're the only ones left. We kind of have to do this. We have to continue building these things because those who have gone on before us can't. They can't create their worlds. Now we have to create those worlds for them, for the people who've gone on before us. It was a legacy for Tolkien. It was something that had to be done. But also, a lot of it really started coalescing, really because of his love of language, but when it really started to get written down, part of the reason he started to document things is he started telling these stories to his children. And whether this anecdote is true or not, I'm not sure. One of the things that really led him to start writing The Hobbit was as he would continue to talk to his children and tell them the stories about this wonderful hobbit named Bilbo, his children began to remind him, like, no, you said that his beard was this length yesterday, and you said that Bilbo's front door was this color yesterday. And so he had to start documenting those things to make sure that he was being consistent from day to day. I don't know, again, if that anecdote is actually true or not, but part of the reason that he began to actually write these texts was it was something to share with his children, something to leave to those who would be after him. And there is a legacy involved in any work like this. Right now, I'm working on writing a novel. I don't know if it will ever be published, but at the end of the day, it will be a story that my daughter will be able to read. It'll be things that her and I can talk about, characters that we'll have inside jokes about. And if that's all the further it goes, I got this beast off my chest and I have something to leave to her, that's fine. I'm working hard on actually believing that and thinking that that's fine. But I think at the end of the day, that will be okay. That'll be fine. And sometimes that's where these worlds go. Our worlds and artwork can be a refuge for us, but there is always a chance, as small as it might be, that they might be the same thing for other people too. Okay, well, what about some practical reasons? All of the things that I have mentioned so far are lovely benefits, things that I experience, and certainly, since this is my podcast, things that I agree with. But I believe there is a potentially stronger case to be made for world building as an artist for its direct benefits to us. How, you may ask? Well, how is focusing on a magical system, on developing histories associated with a particular castle going to improve your art? Let's take a look. It is a great excuse first and foremost to learn about and research very specific things. When you dive into creating a world, you end up rather instinctively creating off of what you know. I live in Colorado, and we specifically live right up against the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. This naturally informs the way that I write and draw when it comes to world building. Naturally, I pull things into the mix. However, when I design a population of people who live in a coastal region, guess what I have to do? I have to look up new references, research how coastal populations came into being and what they eat, how they farm, and if they farm, because I might not actually know. Whereas my instinctive thing is to put lots of snow and ice and mountains and the warmth of spring and the beauty of autumn into my writing naturally, because those are things that I experience here in Colorado. I have innate, visceral, and nostalgic memories of sitting inside a warm house looking out at snow falling. I get a lot of pleasure from going up into the mountains and exploring old ruins, ghost towns, finding things that I've never seen before. My in-laws have lived in this state for 60 years, if I'm remembering correctly, and it feels like every single year they discover new towns. That seems crazy to me, but there are so many tiny little nooks in the mountains, little places that you've driven past 100 times that you never run into. The state is huge. We don't have a gigantic population, but most of the mountainous parts of the state are pretty complicated. And the roads don't always take you where you want to go. And that idea of being able to find new things in an area you've explored a lot, of the joy of discovering new formations of rock, of tiny little lakes, of waterfalls, all of that comes into my world. It naturally infiltrates that which I do, that which I produce. But anytime that I have to go and work from something new, like I mentioned earlier with the coastal stuff or a large deciduous forest, all of that additional information gets crammed into this funky little head of mine, and all these details add into more things that I can draw and put together down the road. Think of it like this. If I sat down to draw a saxophone right now with no references, I could get something that looks remotely like a saxophone. You would look at the drawing and go, yeah, I see what he was trying to do there. However, if I drew a guitar, even though I haven't drawn one in over a decade to my knowledge, that drawing would be good, would include all of the parts, and everything would contextually make sense. Why? Because I play the guitar. I have names for all of the pieces, and because I have that awareness, my art of that subject would be better. I was just talking to a friend yesterday about this, actually, about the fact that a chief component to our development as human beings is vocabulary. The more words that we have, the better able we are to describe things, obviously. But this actually means that we start looking at things differently. If you don't have a specific word for a specific color, you're just going to attribute that to the closest one that you have. If you didn't know the word turquoise, for example, you might refer to turquoise as a light blue. You might refer to it as a light green. You might refer to it as a mix between the two. But once you have that word, you're going to start seeing more variations in that color. Psychologically, your brain now has a label for that thing, and our brains love labeling things. The more you understand about individual subjects, the more you are able to actually articulate those in your words and in your art. All of this knowledge expansion extends into any area of focus and research, but these are some of the most common ones that I've seen and that I run into. Architecture, where if you are exploring what different people groups build where they live, you have to think about the materials they have access to. You have to think about their history. You have to think about the design decisions they're going to be making. Is the weather ever extreme? If it is, then they can't necessarily work on building a building for over a year. They might have to do it in the dry season, or they might only be able to do it during the pockets in between large storms. That might mean that this culture has smaller buildings as opposed to large ones. Maybe it's lots of smaller buildings slammed together. What kind of shapes do they use? That's going to be reflective of weather and climate. Do they grow things there? Do they need to store things? Can they work underground? All of these things, as you research architecture in our own world, are going to impact how you design architecture. What about weapons? Weapons obviously are going to be built on the process of, well, what did they descend from? A lot of our weapons descend from things that were used for hunting originally, and then they get built into larger and more deadly forms. If you have a culture that wasn't warring against humans, how might that influence their weapons? In our world, all of our weapons essentially came from either hunting or from waging war. But what if you were fighting giants? What would weapons look like? What if this particular people group never fought another group of humans? What if they only fought wolves? What if they only fought leviathans in the ocean? All of these things would influence those decisions. And as you look at the weapons that we developed and why we developed those, that's going to impact how you design them in the future. Clothing, obviously going to be very, very similar. What kind of materials do they have access to, and what is the weather like? What about animals that live in that particular place? One of the most fun things about world building is often designing the different creatures and animals. I love to look at the extremophiles, the animals in our world that exist in extreme locations, that have adaptations that let them do bizarre things. Lungfish, which can let themselves basically dry out underground for ages. Things like octopi, like any of the cephalopods, are just crazy, the things that they can do. Chameleons changing color. So we have a lot of really weird animals in our world, and when I want to design something in a book that I'm writing or something along those lines, I just mine our world. I find things that are close, and then I just exaggerate them. Though frankly, if you just took all of the weird animals on our planet and put them into a fantasy story, a lot of people would just assume that these things are your creations because, the platypus is such a weird thing. It's got a soft bill, like a duck. It can detect electrical signals. It is venomous. The males are venomous. They have a little spur in their wrists that allows them to envenomate you. It lays eggs and it lactates through its chest. Not through breasts, but through its chest. There's just so many weird things on this planet. And if you take those things and you exaggerate them, if you think about what makes sense for the creatures that live in this particular location or this particular location, there are so many cool and amazing things you can do. But you get to research those things, and that adds to your own knowledge. What about plants? I'm not going to expand a lot on plants. People get less excited about them. I love them, but they are at least as impactful as animals. Probably more because they almost always make up the base of the food chain. This is one of the coolest things in the Stormlight archive by Brandon Sanderson is he's created pretty much everything from scratch for most of his world. Horses exist, but they come from a weird place. Everything is kind of crustaceans, and even the plants are all semi-sentient or able to move, and it's bizarre. But I love that he's put the time into thinking about how these people feed themselves and all of the plant life. Food is naturally going to extend from this. It's one of the first things I look into when I start to design a particular city. Where is it? What is the weather like? What kind of fruits can they grow there? And it's so much fun to just Google, where does cinnamon grow naturally? And then to think about that and to think about the transportation of those things. A good 50% of my daily joy comes from food, so obviously this is going to be something I focus on. But here's another that you might not think about. What about logo design? Every country has to have an emblem, a banner, certain signs, and of course their own language that is going to tell things about who they are. If you look back at a lot of ancient languages, you get things like hieroglyphics, where it's tiny little images that display what's being told, as opposed to ours, which are abstractions of things like that. But playing around with the logo designs, in particular playing around with what they might have been ages ago when they were first developed and they get simplified over time, I think that's a really, really cool thing to look at. Just go look at the logo for Coke or Pepsi and how it's changed over the years. And that's only been 100 years. And then think about if this castle was originally inhabited 10,000 years ago, how abstracted the logo, the banner, the symbol, the emblem of that country might be. It's just fun to play with. It's just fun to think about what that might do. And if you go into any writing here, which I know not all of you are writers, but I think that there are some distinct writing advantages. What about sayings? What about mottos, concepts and ideas, mythologies? So many of our phrases come from the things around us. I think there's something like 100 different phrases in the English language that tie back into chickens, henpecked, cockeyed, all these kinds of things that really, they come, if you've ever worked around animals, you understand that all of these phrases, all these metaphors, they all make sense. But what if this culture grew up in the Arctic regions where there were very distinct agricultural and animal husbandry methodologies that were developed. Very distinct from what my ancestors would have used, right? But this can be a really interesting thing to think about because that means that the phrases are going to be different. A lot of the stuff that we say today only makes sense because of the particular history that we come from, and that changes in your world. Another practical benefit is that it helps cover a breadth of artistic study. Not only do you have all of the individual components as mentioned before, but you explore different aspects of art. This is fun and really makes your artistic practices far wider. We all seem to trend toward one or two areas of focus in our artwork, but when you world build, you have to diversify, and most of the time, you diversify into things that are not altogether in your wheelhouse. You explore, you try new things, you fail, you cry a little, and then you get back on it. When you build a world, you have to naturally consider a lot of extraneous things, and you end up exploring other artistic realms, like some of these. Graphic design, which kind of came up a little bit in logo design a moment ago. But what are the shapes that they would be using to show things? We see this a lot in the cinematic adaptations of The Lord of the Rings. The elves, all of the shape language with the elves is curvy and cyclical. All of the shape language with Mordor is very spiky and violent. All of the shape language with the dwarves is very blocky and geometric. And then the human is just kind of reminiscent of our own past. But in your world, you get to make those decisions. You have to think about the graphic design elements of something, of what the shape language articulates. If you think back to old cartoons that we have in the West, a lot of those characters are blocky, they're curvy. There's a lot of decisions that you can make based on what you want to represent. Color is a really, really intriguing choice as well. We kind of don't think about color as much, and in a sketchbook session not that long ago, I talked about how dangerous it is. But colors are very, very important. You know, in our past, we often talk about how purple was a color for royalty. You don't always talk about why. It was because purple dye for a long time only came from crushing these tiny little snails, and each snail only gave you this tiny little amount, and so you needed to find and crush a lot of these tiny little snails to get enough dye to dye anything of substance. And so obviously then that made it very expensive, and that's why it was attributed to royalty. Another thing like this is saffron. Saffron is very, very expensive because it comes from a flower where you can only harvest a couple threads every season. So it's a very, very difficult to get substance in any kind of quantity, and therefore it is something that is attributed to wealth. What do these things look like in your world? Well, maybe the graphic design and logo design stuff is in your wheelhouse. It's something that's pretty normal for you. But what about character designs? There's going to be people in your world, right? People of some kind. And if that is not something that you normally put time into, now you have to. Now you have to figure out how to draw people. And for me, this has been one of the big additions to my world building. People are hard. They're a difficult thing for me to represent. I would really probably spend most of my time just doing things like you're watching in the background here. Landscapes and buildings and architecture. I'm a designer by trade, not a painter or a drawer necessarily. I'm a designer first, though I have a lot of love and affection for drawing and painting, and I keep working in those areas. But it forces me to get out of the things that would be comfortable for me. You know, honestly, this drawing of this city hanging above a volcano, the easy way for me to do this, the way that I almost always drew this, was I drew it from the side entirely with no three-dimensionality to it, working on the design and how everything functions. That's easy for me. It's low stress. To actually throw it in an environment where you've got some foreshortening, some perspective, thinking about what's happening all around the image, the composition, it's difficult, and it forces me to get better. It forces me to change. And that actually takes you into the next thing, which is designing buildings and designing environments. If you mostly draw characters, that's going to be a big leap for you. But if you are invested in your world, you're probably going to be willing to spend that time to get into something that's new, to draw out these environments, to work out on how do you actually draw ice? How do you draw rock? How do you draw trees? All of those things are going to benefit you because it's just adding more things to your library. The same is true for creature design. Creature design and character design often seem to overlap, but I would venture to say that they are very different skill sets. I really like designing creatures far more than I like working with characters. I would like to like working with characters, but I've got a lot to learn there. Creature design is its own beast. Oh, that's funny. I didn't intend that pun, but I'm leaving it in. Creature design is its own thing. It is its own set of skills. And if you tend towards other things, your world needs to be inhabited by creatures. And so you're going to have to create some creatures to go there. So not only do you get to learn about these things, but there are practical reasons to actually sit down and play with them now. They fit into your world. Does world building help you as an artist in general? Even if you don't want to write a novel or make a show online at some point, is it still worth it? I think this is a relevant question to ask. I obviously have a large desire to create these worlds, to do something with them, but you don't necessarily have that. Is it still a good idea for you to think about, for you to explore the concept of world building? I think so, yeah. It's not just as simple as focusing on the end product. You are, through world building, focusing on so many individual things. So even if your express goal is not to do anything with this world, you might be very surprised what kinds of creatures, environments, graphic design decisions, and characters come out of your time invested into this thing. Now, there's certainly a portion of me that feels like I want more people to do this because I really enjoy it and I really love it. But I do honestly think, as a teacher, as an instructor, that this might be one of those strange kind of hacks or tricks for helping yourself to stick to something for longer. The more time that you invest in the world, yes, there is a greater chance that you're going to fall in love with it, that you're going to fall in love with the sub-creation. But undoubtedly, what you're going to do is you're going to have to solve problems. You're going to have to learn how to draw new things that you haven't worked on before. You're going to naturally expose some of the areas where you lack skill, where you lack knowledge. And that's not always very comfortable. It's kind of a discomforting thing to realize that all of your growth hasn't been exactly what you thought it was, and that you still have a lot of areas to focus on, a lot of things to do. I'm comfortable with this. Partially because I'm old, partially because I taught students who at a certain level actually got better than me, and I had to be humbled by that. I had to understand that that's okay. That's actually the goal. My job is to teach students to be better than me at some point, right? You want your kids to be better than you, and teaching in some way is like a pseudo, parental mentor-like relationship in a lot of ways. So I really do think that this is a beneficial thing for most artists. And I think that it could be artificially constructed. I think if you are going to school for something, even like, let's say you're a graphic design student, where this might be as far away from your desire as possible. But if you, in that sense, go, well, I'm going to construct in my mind and maybe on paper a fictional country, and they are going to be stationed during World War II or maybe in the modern era, and you start thinking about all of the propaganda, the posters, the emblems, the political parties, the companies, and start thinking about all of those things that exist in our own world and start creating them and trying to think about the myths and the world building and the lore behind this fictional country. It's a goldmine for you for creating new ideas because you're thinking about things from a very distinctly different perspective. When you go to create an emblem or a logo for something nowadays, you are naturally thinking about our world and how things are constructed. But if you are putting yourself into a fictional world, you have different ways of solving those problems. Is that going to come back and help you in this world? Absolutely. The designs might not translate entirely right away, but the problem solving will. The ability to think outside the box. And that's probably like the hardest area to figure it out for like a graphic designer, somebody who really works on something different. If you have any desire to be a character designer, to make cartoons, to have your own webcomic or something like that, then I think that the benefits are really indisputable. It will benefit you tremendously. Even if you don't really have the motivation yourself normally to start creating your own world, to bring something to light, you would be happy working for somebody else as long as you get to paint and draw. Building your own world, constructing your own thing that you can dive into gives you so many reasons to expand your skills. And it gives you so many motivations and inspirations to do so. And a lot of times without even knowing that's what you're doing. And I'm a big fan of any time I can trick myself into working when I don't know I'm working. I actually have my Nintendo Switch hooked up in the workout room here at home so I can run on the elliptical while I play my Switch. And then I basically trick myself into working out because I hate running. But I need to do it. I need to stay healthy. And so anytime I feel like I can trick myself into doing work where it doesn't feel like work, it's just a bonus. Maybe that's a me thing, but I would encourage you to try this as well. I would encourage you, regardless of what you are doing artistically, start thinking about creating a world, and maybe just start really, really simply. And maybe if you want some hints, some tips on how to go about starting that, let me know in the comments below. I'd be happy to do another little video. I don't know if it'd be a full podcast or not, but I'd be happy to do something else to walk you through just maybe some strategies to get you started. Well, as always, thank you for your time. This podcast has been quite different. Not only was the content in the background different over the course of the podcast, but this is something that is a little bit outside of the normal stuff. I have no idea how this podcast will do with the dreaded algorithms, but I think it's an important thing. World building is super important to me. I love it. I'm working right up at the end of my novel right now, my first draft, and I'm really excited about these things. And I feel like it's worth sharing. This is something that is near and dear to my heart, and I think that it's done a lot of good in my life, and I just hope that other people will imbibe of that. I hope you listening, if you haven't started it yet, you'll give it a try, because it's just benefited me so much, and it's benefited a lot of people in my life so much that I hope that can be extended to you. If you're looking to join an art community, you can check out the link to our Discord server down below. We do studies and weekly drawing prompts together on there, and it's just a great place to share what you're working on at present. I show pieces like this as I'm working through them, and I can get help there. And if you need something like that, please check out the Discord. Thank you to patron Who, What, Where, When for your continued support. And if you are interested in helping decide what happens in these podcasts, what random things I ramble about in the sketchbook sessions, and seeing the scripts and outlines for these things while they are still in progress, you can support the channel through the Patreon link below. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.